Salvete discipuli. Today's video is the second lesson in Chapter 11 in Latin for the New Millennium, Volume 2, and it is on the uses of the participle, or the use of the participle. You, of course, know how to use participles. You've actually been using participles really for a long time because you have been using the perfect passive participle and the future passive participle since last year. The present participle is one of the more common participles. I would say the perfect passive and the present active are the two more common ones. And it's very often used in participial phrases as a participial phrase, I should say, as part of a participial phrase. There we go. And you need to know the appropriate way to translate the participle, both in terms of its relative tense. Now, we've talked about relative tense before. We talked about relative tense in terms of how to translate the infinitives, okay? And you also need to know how to translate it in terms of making it sound as good as possible in English, okay? So, like with the infinitive, when you translate the participle, the tense is not absolute. Instead, the tense of the participle tells you how to translate the participle in relation to the main verb. And this is just like the infinitives. A present participle is telling you that the action of the participle happens at the same time as the action of the main verb, okay? Which means that the present participle can sometimes translate as a perfect, right? In English, right? So you could say something along the lines of having heard the noise, the girl ran from the house. Okay, ran is in the perfect, which means that present participle having heard would be in Latin, audiens, it would be the present participle, but you're translating it to occur at the same time as the action of the main verb. And since the main verb is perfect, you would translate this present participle as a perfect. Just like with the infinitives, the perfect participle tells us that the participle happened before the action of the main verb. So if you have a perfect main verb and you have a perfect participle, that perfect participle sometimes will sound a little pluperfect-y. And again, the future participle tells you that the action of the participle is happening after the action of the main verb. Now, that's one half of what you need to keep in mind as we translate the participles, okay? The present, the perfect, and the future participles. The second thing you need to understand is that, and I know we've said this in class quite a bit, Latin uses participles so much more frequently than English tends to, okay? We are a fairly verbose language, English is, whereas Latin is a very sparse language. They like to say as much as possible in as few words as possible. So because of that, in Latin, they like to use participles because they're very compact and they get the point across with just using one word, right? Whereas in English, we would rather use a subordinate clause in some way. For that reason, when you translate the participles into English or a participial phrase into English, sometimes it will just sound better to make it into a subordinate clause. And I have some general guidelines in this video on how or what's the best way to make it into a subordinate clause, okay? Sometimes you're going to want to make it into a subordinate clause introduced by the conjunctions since or because or when. We call this, when we use when as the conjunction to introduce the subordinate clause, we call this the temporal use of the participle. When we use since or because, we call it the causal use of the participle. Okay, and I have some examples on the next slide, so we'll go over that in a second. Sometimes, honestly, it'll sound better to translate the participial phrase into a relative clause, especially if the participle is describing a person, be it a name or the boy, the man, the girl, the woman, or the sailor, the farmer, or the occupation, okay? So let's look at these three sentences, each one of which contains a participle or a participial phrase. We should look at the relative tense of the participle, or the tense of the participle relative to the tense of the main verb. And we should also look at whether it sounds better in English to translate this as a participial phrase or to translate it as a subordinate clause. And then we should probably figure out which one of the subordinate clauses it sounds best as, okay? So our first sentence, adolescens, ad urbem ire conans, se equusque paravit, okay? So we know that our main sentence is the adolescens, the youth, the young man, prepared himself and the horses, okay? Now, we also have this, we'll make it yellow. We also have this participle, conans, which is describing adolescens, which we know because, of course, both of them are nominative singular, okay, in this case masculine, but nominative singular. So we know that it's the boy, conans, trying to go ad urbem, to the city. Okay. Now, let's put both of those two elements together. We have our present participle here, and we want to look at the tense relative to this perfect main verb. So the young man, having tried ire, to go to the city, prepared himself and the horses. Okay. Now, again, it sometimes sounds a little weird to use participles so frequently in English, or at least as frequently as Latin would use them. So let's think about which one of the subordinate clauses would sound best here. I think you could do a relative clause, the young man who tried to go to the city, prepared himself and the horses. I think you could also say the young man, when he tried to go to the city, prepared himself and the horses. And that's the other thing. I can't tell you definitively whether you're going to want to use like the temporal use of the participle, the causal use, or a relative clause. Honestly, it's what sounds best in English. And sometimes there'll be two options that really are solid options. And then you just make a judgment call, and that's fine. I think either one of those translations would work perfectly for this first sentence. As a little side note, I would like for you to have both of those translations in your notes, and you should be writing down the translations as we go over them. Okay, this next sentence. Populus putavit legatos, gerentes vincula, servos esse. So the people thought that legatos esse servos, that the ambassadors were slaves. Okay, that's our main sentence here. We now have this participle, gerentes, which is modifying legatos, right? So the people thought that the ambassadors, gerentes vincula, carrying chains, were slaves. Now, again, we need to think about the tense of this participle in relation to the main verb, which is putavit. And then we also need to think about which subordinate clause would perhaps sound best to turn this participial phrase into. So the people thought that the ambassadors who carried chains, or because they carried chains, were slaves. And again, notice that we're translating this essay, which is a present infinitive, as a perfect, because we have a perfect main verb, putavit. They thought that the ambassadors were slaves. They thought that the ambassadors who were carrying or who carried chains were slaves. Okay? And again, I think this one sounds just as good as a causal. The people thought that the ambassadors, because they carried chains, were slaves. I think we could also translate this as a temporal. The people thought that the ambassadors, when they carried the chains, were slaves. So it really does come down to a judgment call on the case of the translator. Okay. And then our last sentence, mater puero exclamanti dixit eum tacere debere. Our main sentence here, of course, being that the mother said to the boy that he ought to be quiet. Okay. Now we have this infinitive exclamanti, which is dative and describing puero, right? So the mother said to the boy, shouting, exclaiming, that he ought to be quiet. And again, the mother said to the boy when he exclaimed that he ought to be quiet. The mother said to the boy who exclaimed that he ought to be quiet. Any of these actually sound better in English than just translating the participle literally. Okay. All right. Make sure you take good notes. I hope you all have a lovely evening, and I will see you in class. Walete.